Welcome, everybody. My name is Susan Warren, and I'm a program manager on the ASP Plus .NET Frameworks team. Specifically, I'm very intimately involved on a daily basis with the web forms technology. That's the technology that is used to create web UI in the .NET frameworks. So I just want to know a little bit about you before we begin. How many people here are currently developing apps with ASP? Yeah, lots and lots of folks. Good. That's good to know because I want to make sure I pitched my presentation in the right way. How many people were at my session this morning? A few of you. Okay, so that's good. We won't have too much overlap, but there'll be a little bit. So let's talk about what this is going to be about today. Oh, one more question. How many people were at Mark Anders' introduction this morning? A few of you. There'll be a little overlap for you guys as well in this session. What we're going to target is just the UI layer, just the web forms layer in not only this session, but the hour immediately following. And there's a good reason for it. We really want to let you know all of the new innovations that are in ASP Plus over ASP. It's really a great evolutionary change. A couple of the things that you should know, people have asked me about already. ASP Plus pages run side by side with classic ASP apps on the same web server. That's Windows 2000 and IIS 5, plus the .NET frameworks. Your current ASP apps continue to run, and ASP Plus apps can run as well. The next thing that's worth mentioning, although you've probably heard it a couple of times, is that we've tried to do what we could to preserve the best parts of ASP, things like the just save and simply FTP kind of deployment, but make better the things that were some of the shortcomings of ASP in the past, like compilation of script or to P code instead of actually compiling it right down to native code. So in the case of these demos, we'll see lots of script blocks, but it's never really script. The code inside those script blocks will get compiled to IL and then eventually executed as native code. The really big takeaway, though, from working with ASP Plus web forms is the third point on this slide, and that's the new execution model. We'll spend some time going more deeply into that than you have in the last couple of sessions. It's really great because you get to encapsulate your functionality in reasonable to manage pieces inside of controls and a larger factor inside of pagelets. And we'll cover both of those in this session today. So here's the agenda. Oh, and note, if you have the printed slides, the agenda is slightly different for part 2. The actual slides themselves are the same, just rearranged a little bit. Put the data binding at the end after validation, otherwise they're the same. So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the really basics so you know exactly what works, what doesn't. We're going to talk about what a server control is, how it works. We're going to talk about code basics, what works, how to get it working. And then we're going to take a tour of all the different controls that we ship. There's a whole bunch of them. And then finally we'll spend some time on pagelets. Later on this afternoon, we're going to talk about input validation and data binding. So let's get started. Page basics. So the most basic ASP Plus page you can make is just plain old HTML. In other words, a page that has plain HTML in it will execute just fine if it's named with the .aspx extension. Just works. It's just a plain old HTML page. In addition, ASP Plus pages contain things like directives. Now, you all have seen these before, those of you who've used ASP, like language equal VB. That's a directive. There are a number of new ones in ASP Plus, but those work still. Something new are server controls. We'll spend a lot of time on those. Server script blocks are familiar to you. Those still exist in this framework. Another brand new thing that we'll spend some time on in the next session is data binding. Another great new thing that I'm going to talk about right now for a minute, server-side comments. And then finally, render blocks, which should be familiar to those of you guys who are currently working with ASP. So server-side comments. Currently, if you want to make a comment, the comment itself will get rendered down to the client if you do it in HTML form. This new syntax, right here where we go angle bracket percent dash, excuse me, 2 dashes, and then end dash dash percent angle bracket, those comments will show up in your server-side code but never be rendered to the client. So bonus number 1 on ASP+. So before I go back and do that, I want to just do a couple quick little demos. We in demo land? I'm going to go to my other PC for the demos, number 7. There we go. And I am in the wrong project. I'm so sorry. Let me go and open up this one. So this should look familiar by now. You've probably seen this 3 times already. This is the same page that Mark Andrews was showing in his 2 things. Plain old HTML. And he ran this thing with the .aspx extension as this guy has right now. And in fact, I can view this in the browser. Go down here, and there it is. That's that same page that had the problem with the posting back of data. So plain HTML. And you probably have already seen this one as well, but I'll show it again just to make sure we get the point across. I'll put that there maybe. In this case, I'm just putting in some render blocks. Render blocks still work. This one is just going to do a for loop and render welcome to ASP Plus 7 times. Right? So nothing here that you can't do today in ASP. It all still works. So let's go back now to slides and talk about some of the new stuff, server controls. There we go. So server control, there are a few different kinds, but there's one set that we ship inside of the product that is just taking an HTML tag and putting run at server on it, just like you did with script blocks in the past. And that's a pretty cool thing. That's all you have to do to it. And once you've done run at server, we actually create a corresponding control to that tag on the server. And it's available at runtime on the server to program against, data bind, and so forth. So here are a couple of examples. The first one is an HTML control, as I just described. Input type equal text, ID, run at server. So I can programmatically use that guy now on the server. The second example is the other kind of server control, the more abstract server control that doesn't directly relate to an HTML tag. But again, it's available for me to work with programmatically on the server. We'll work with a number of them this afternoon, so you'll get a chance to get a feel for what I mean by working with these programmatically. 2 things I want you to walk away from this little example is the tag identifies which control we will create, but the ID attribute gives us the programmatic accessor. So here's another example, a little deeper. Tag, whatever the tag is, I equal T1, text equal foo. Text is a property on that tag. And I can programmatically access that by saying T1.text equal. In this case, text is a string value. My second example shows T2 height equal 5. Programmatically, in code, it may actually be strongly typed when I work against it in code, and I might have to assign an integer to it in this case. T2.height equal 99. In the declarative part of your page, when you're actually declaring server controls intermixed with the HTML, tags and attributes are case insensitive. They may not be depending on your choice of common language up in the code. For example, in VB, they're case insensitive. In C#, they aren't. We're case sensitive. So actually, before I go forward, let me just come back to the example. So this was that last page we just worked on. I'm going to open up a different version of this, and this is the same page except done with server controls. I've replaced my input type equal text with text box, my select with drop down list, and my input type equal button with button. Just like with adding run at server, as Mark Anders did yesterday and also earlier today, on an input tag, I still need run at server on these more abstract controls. Let's go ahead and run this guy. This time I'll type something reasonable. And it round trip the values. So now we're at the point where we can talk about maintaining state and postback. Let's go back to slides. So I hope I haven't, I ran past that pretty fast because I feel like you guys have seen that part of the demo several times already. Hopefully I haven't, oh yeah, good, good. Okay, I want to get past that so we can get on to the good stuff. Okay, input control postback. For controls that take input, things like that text box and that drop-down list, or if you prefer to think of it input type equal text or select, will automatically save the state of the control when the user posted it to the server and insert it back into the control. So I typed Susan in that text box. The framework took care of pasting that value back into the control. Likewise with the drop-down list. This is a huge win. Anybody who's done any forms on the web where you're filling stuff in and people might have to post back a couple of times in the course of validation, it saves a lot of logic in terms of figuring out what was in the forms collection when the request went up, walking across it, grabbing those values out, and assigning them back to the different inputs. This just a big savings. It makes your code much simpler. It just makes your job easier, too. Easier to read the code and so forth. And it works with all browsers. We're just using postback. No special stuff there. So let's go back here one more time to the postback, or to the code. Unfortunately, I like to switch back and forth a lot, and it takes a little minute. The one last thing I wanted to show you here was the actual source. But this is very large. I hope you can see enough of it. For the most part, this is just the same HTML that we typed initially. This is the view source in the browser. It was actually sent down to the browser by those controls I used, ASP colon text box, ASP colon drop down list. You'll see one big difference is this guy right here. This is one of the ways that we maintain state in the page. The other way is that when I push this button, we'll automatically walk across that forms collection. Okay. Let's go back to slides for just a minute. I'll slow down now. I just wanted to get past that part that you'd seen before. So, server code. All the examples I've shown since I've been here, and all the ones I've actually seen, have showed the server code in a script block in the ASPX page. That's not a requirement. It's just simpler for us to demo it, to have it all close by on one page and you can visualize it, rather than flipping between files. This framework provides an excellent means of separating the HTML from the code. So there are a couple of different ways to do this. You can do it in a server block, as I have these examples. Another way to do it is to have a script run at server source equal block, where you point off to a source page, and the contents of your script block would be in that source. The third way is something that Visual Studio supports, and that's to create a class file that is itself derived from the ASP Plus page class. And then your page inherits from it. So it's really a self-contained class file. And that's the method that Visual Studio uses to maintain a really clear separation between the HTML part of the page, or the declarative part of the page, and the code. But at runtime, execution-wise, they're essentially the same thing. You could easily cut your code from one and move it to the other with no change. So code can contain variables, methods, and most importantly, event handlers. So let's talk a little bit about events. So I said earlier that we had this nice control-based encapsulation and also event-driven execution. And the most basic event-driven execution is that of the page itself. By having a set of steps that happen during execution, you don't have to any longer have a big if-then-else statement at the top of your page to make sure the right things happen when somebody clicks button 3 as opposed to button 2 in your page. You can just handle the events, and the order of execution is handled by the page framework itself. Really, really cleans up the organization of your code. So your code can sync the page events. In addition, you can sync events that are thrown by controls that you put on the page. So if I push that button that we've been pushing, that lookup button, instead of causing a postback, I can have it throw an event, hook that event in my server-side code, and process it. And if I have 4 buttons on the page, they can do 4 different events. And I can very specifically make sure that I execute only the code associated with that event. So there are 2 categories of events. There are what we think of as action events, clicks, basically, on buttons or selection on a drop-down list. And then there are also changed events, where a user will change the contents of a control, for example, but it would not force a postback. And both of those 2 different kinds of events can be processed. So in this case, I could even hook changing the value of my text box from Susan to Frank as code that executes on the server, even though it didn't force a postback. So very nice encapsulation, and any server control can actually implement these. Many of the controls implement more than one event. So here's the basic chain of events. Page load happens. Well, actually, there's some processing that happens ahead of the time. Your page is instantiated. All the controls on the page are instantiated and initialized. So if you've defined default values for them either declaratively in XML and your HTML, they'll be assigned. Then the page load event is called, and any code that's inside of that will execute. Then your change events are called. Within the group of change events, there's no real predetermined order. They're all just called in a sort of I can't recall the word I'm looking for. You can't really rely on the order. And then the action events are called. And then page unload is called. Page unload happens after the page has rendered, though. So between your action events calling, the page is rendered to the client, and page unload is called. So page unload is really available there for cleanup, largely. And then outside of your code, your user code, the page objects are disposed. So let's go ahead and work with a couple of these different events in the sample that we're building here. Let me do a couple of things to this page. First of all, I want to pull out a label. This will give us an opportunity to put some text into the page. And it's a pretty simple control. It just says ASP label, ID equal message, some font size so that you guys can actually see it when we assign a value to it. And what I'm going to do is assign the value of this label in the page load event. So I don't know if I do have a script block here. So there's my page load event. It's pretty simple. It says message.text equal hi everyone. So it's going to use the programmatic identifier, this guy, of my label and assign the text property. Let's go ahead and save and give that a whirl. Hi everyone. So big deal, right? So that's a pretty interesting thing. It's a start. But it's not wildly interesting because I could have set that text property in my right on my declarative tag declaration. If it's just going to make that assignment every time the page loads, it's not really wildly interesting. So let's change what that actually shows here and have it, instead of putting some static text in there, pull some values out of the other controls. So in this case, I say hi, name.text, concatenate that string and say you selected category.selecteditem.text. So name is the programmatic identifier of my text box, and category is the programmatic identifier of my drop-down list. Go ahead and save that. Refresh. And now you can see that I'm getting something a little more interesting happening. I'll be frank today. Okay? So that's pretty good stuff. Finally, I want to, well, actually, let's go back to slides and we'll come back to the next piece. So here's the example we just did. So page load fires on every request, but sometimes you don't really want to process the logic on every request. So we give you a property of page that allow you to make conditional logic on page load. So, for example, if you saw the iBuySpy application, it makes sense in that application to load information from the database, for example, the categories that drive the menu of the different categories of products you can browse in page load initially, and then in subsequent round trips not load that, because that could be cached, that value could be cached by the data list control that's displaying it. So very often database access happens only on page load and then maybe in response to a user action. Go ahead and update it. So there's a way that you can conditionally execute logic around page load, and it's this if not page is postback. So page is postback is a property on page that's true if the page has just been posted back to. On the initial load of the page, it's false. So by saying if not page postback, I'm going to execute the logic contained in that statement only on the initial load. So let's go ahead and change our little sample here to do that. So let's say if not page dot is first load then, and if message dot text, sorry, page is postback. First load, else okay, so how I've changed this is that on the first load, it's going to say first load in that label. Subsequent loads, it'll pull those values from the other controls on the page. Let me refresh this page. Actually, let me start again. Make sure I get a first load on it. Oh, there it is. So there's my first load. And the subsequent loads. So that's pages postback. Okay, going back to slides for a minute. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. You're going to have to save your questions until afterwards. Okay, so these are the events we talked about earlier. Change events only occur on the next request to the server because they only execute there. Action events cause an immediate postback. The cool thing about these things is that they work with any browser. There's nothing fancy going down on the client. It's just form logic in HTML. So the next thing that we want to find out about is how do I wire up my own action events, or for that matter, change events. We have a declarative method of wiring up a particular control to a specific method in the page. And that method becomes the event handler for that event. The tags, the attributes rather, that declare the events are fixed. They're specific names. For example, on a button, it's onClick equal. On an ASP text box, it's onChanged equal. And there's an example of an event handler code. So one advantage of doing this is that, of course, you don't want to handle all your button clicks and page load, as we've been doing. It makes a lot more sense to handle them individually in their own event handlers. So let's go back to code and do that really quick. I have a button click event here. And this button click event does essentially the same thing that page load did before. I'm going to change my page load to only set my initial text. So if it's not postback, it's going to say first load. Otherwise, we're going to rely on the button's click event handler to set the text of that message box. The next thing I need to do is I need to actually make sure that the ID of this button matches. Well, the ID of the button doesn't need to. By convention, I typically would have it match this. But it doesn't have to. What I really need is I need to put in my submit button underscore click. Oops, I am typing too fast. There we go. The wire up for that button. Now when I click that button, it's going to call this event handler. View that guy in the browser. First load. Call this Sam. Sam likes popular computers. And then we've got that text being handled there. Let's just go to source one more time so you get a sense of what's going on here. So when I did the post back to the page and I got my values put back into my controls, it actually assigned Sam into the value when it rendered the page down the next time. That's really what's happening under the hood. Likewise, popular computers was the one that was selected, and that was rendered right into the select, the HTML select that went down to the page. You can see, I think one of the important things to notice here is that there's no JavaScript at all on this page. It's totally independent of JavaScript. It's just using postback. It's a very lightweight framework for that sort of thing. Some of my view state is persisted here. This is the view state for the label itself. Oops, go back. But that's it. That's the only little magic that's going on, is this hidden field inside the form. Okay, going back to slides for a minute. Page unload fires after the page is rendered. So there's nothing you can do in unload that will affect the rendering of the page. It's really useful for things like logging and cleanup. Although hopefully if you're using database connections, you've already long since closed those. So people typically don't handle page unload very frequently, and when they do it, it's usually for some special purpose instrumentation or logging in their app. So there's another concept that we just saw a little bit in the view state for that label. For non-input controls, we'll also persist the value of that control across round trips. It's optional. You don't necessarily want to persist the value of a control across round trips, so we can do that for controls like label and data grid, etc. By default, when you put a value into that control or a set of values into that control, we'll also store them off in that hidden field we just looked at. Then when you round trip the page, for example, you click the search button or you use the little search box on iBuySpy.com, it'll bring all the other stuff back in addition to giving you the search results. So whatever your menu selection was and so forth, you'll get all that stuff back, but because it restored all the values, you're only really round tripping that search box. You can disable this by the entire page or on a control by control basis. And it may have some impact on performance. It's worth checking out. There's a session later in the week on ASP Plus performance and caching that I really recommend for understanding how you could control the rendering of your pages and minimize the amount of view state that's stored. Especially for very large pages, that might be worthwhile. For very small ones, it's probably not going to buy you much. But it does affect the overall size of the page that's rendered to the browser. So a couple more things. Import directives. So there are lots of things in the .NET framework that you're going to want to be able to use from your ASP Plus pages. Things like data objects. We actually had a chance to do this in this morning's session. We used some data, and we imported a namespace system.data. This is how you do it inside of the declarative file. It's angle bracket %, ampersand, import, namespace equal, and then the namespace name as a string. The main thing that this gets you inside of the page is you don't have to fully qualify the name of a data set, for example. Otherwise, it's not an issue because at compile time, ASP Plus takes care of the references for you, for the most part. There are some classes where it doesn't, but this is really for your convenience in terms of typing class names that come out of the framework. Okay, so that's sort of the first, how does the basic page framework work? Now we want to get into control families and spend some time looking at it because it's very confusing for people. Lots and lots of people ask me, well, when would I use that ASP text box you showed me versus using the input type equals text, run it equals server? Aren't they the same thing? So this is the question we're going to try and answer over the next few minutes. We ship, in ASP Plus, in the version that you got today, we ship 45 built-in controls. Some of these are map one-to-one to HTML, and some of them are the more abstract ones. We've organized them into logical families, and within what we call the web controls, the abstract ones, there are several different versions of those as well. HTML server controls are really one-to-one HTML, and they have run at equals server added to the tag. So this morning we did a nice little demo where we took an HTML page and turned it into an ASP Plus page by adding run at server and turning some of the HTML into a template for a templated control. When you have that kind of an experience where you get from an HTML designer a page that's already designed, and they say, here's how it should look, you add in the database access and the other dynamic functionality into the page, this is one way to get there, is to go through and find the few tags that you actually need to deal with programmatically, turn them into server controls by adding an ID and run it server. So there's a whole bunch of supported controls. Here's the list. It's not everything you could possibly think of in HTML, but it's a bunch of them. And it's quite a powerful methodology for creating an ASP Plus web form. You've seen it several times in the last 2 days, and there's a good reason for it. So before I go forward, I want to go back to my demo machine and point you at something that's called the ASP Plus Quick Start. So I probably have had 24 people in the last 24 hours come up to me and say, "Oh, this looks great. When can I get the bits?" The answer is, you have the bits. Everything I'm showing you today, in fact, almost everything you've seen at this conference, if not everything, is you're capable of doing with the CDs that you got this morning. There's nothing I'm running on my demo machine that doesn't come off of those CDs, including this ASP Plus Quick Start. And this is an incredible resource for you guys. It's really something worth checking into. And I'll come back to it a couple of times, but it's gonna really fill in a lot of the gaps for you. So there's a section here on ASP Plus web forms in the ASP Plus Quick Start. The scope of this is broader. It covers all of the parts of ASP Plus applications. The web forms chapter here, though, just covers web forms. The next to the last item in this list is called Web Forms Controls Reference. I'm going to click that. And you can see that there's a big table here. I hope you can read this. It lists those same controls I just showed you on the other slide, but it shows you the actual control name, the class name inside of the .NET frameworks. For example, there's a class name here called HTML Input Checkbox. That's the same as input type equal checkbox. So you can probably map the names pretty easily just by taking a look. But it's also valuable to come in and have a look at the samples themselves. There are samples for every single control we ship inside of this Quick Start. You can run them. And this is, not wildly compelling, but you can also see the code, which is compelling. So we'll show you, this happens to be a C# example. There's also a VB example for every one of these guys. It'll give you an opportunity. So just a piece of advice, after you've installed that .NET framework on your system, you get a link here that says NGWS SDK Overview. Open that up. Oh, here it is over here. Find the link that says NGWS Samples and follow the instructions to install this guy. You will not be sorry. It's very, very helpful. One last thing I want to show you before I get off of Quick Start. Other people will show you this too. It's very important. There are several sample applications that get installed with this. One of these is a class browser application. And you have sources for this as well, which is interesting. But this uses reflection against the namespaces in the .NET framework. And it's an excellent place to go learn more about the object model of these controls that we're looking at. So they're all down here in the system.web.ui.html controls or system.web.ui.webcontrols namespaces. And let's just drill into that same HTML input checkbox we were looking at before. I'm sorry, I think I have my browser fonts boosted, and it's not going to help us. Sorry. But you can see not only do I see all the properties and methods of this control, but also all of their types. So it's a really fast and easy way to get a sense of what's possible with any given control. Okay, so let's come back to slides. I think we're coming back to slides. This is always the tricky bit. Can we come back to slides? Well, while we're waiting for slides to come back, there's a whole bunch of web controls down here, too. Okay, we'll come back. Okay, so web controls. Why? Well, so you've got all those HTML ones. What do you need with the web controls? So the web controls have a couple of interesting differences, and depending on who you are, you might see these as being advantages. They have a consistent object model. So we decided, let's also make a set that's more abstract and really more similar to what you might have found in VB in the past for VB forms. So that when you have a button and you want to set the text on the button, that property's name is text. When you set the text on the label, the property's name is text. When you set the text in the text box, the property's name is text. Very consistent in terms of the names of the properties. Also, giving properties to things that didn't have properties in the past. An example is label. So in HTML land, you can do a span and assign some, if you're a DHTML wizard, assign some inner HTML content to that, and it becomes a label for you. But one of the things you can't do is you can't set back color on a span. The background color is not an attribute of a span. However, it is an attribute of label. Label will render as a span, and we'll do the magic around to put a back color on it. But you as a programmer didn't have to know what the HTML itself was capable of. You just code against these things as regular controls with a consistent object model. That's the first thing. The second thing is we offer some automatic up-level, down-level support for these controls. The HTML controls map one-to-one. Anything you put on that control as an attribute is going to render as an attribute on the HTML tag down to the browser. However, in web controls, we'll abstract it for you. And we'll do some smart things for rendering for certain of our controls. To be frank, not many of them do this yet. I'll show you some tricks with the validation controls at the beginning of the next hour. But it is something that's baked into the framework, and as we get closer to shipping this product, we'll have more and more of these that do more dramatic differences between up-level and down-level rendering. And then finally, the web controls are strongly typed. So if you want to take advantage of type checking inside of the .NET frameworks, the web controls participate in that. If you have a color, for example, up here I show label 1.backcolor equal color.red. That's a strongly typed value. You can get error checking, syntax checking inside of Visual Basic or Visual Studio, for example, by using these strongly typed values. So there are a bunch of different web controls. The first ones are the intrinsics. So, for example, ASP button. ASP button today renders as, on a regular browser at least, renders as input type equal button. So not very interesting. But it does have those three advantages that we talked about on the other slide. It's strongly typed, consistent object model, and may do up-level, down-level rendering at some point. Here's a whole list of the other ones involved as well. So I'm going to go back over to my demo machine and give you a quick demo of ASP button. Right out of my quick start stuff. So we actually have a lot of information about buttons here. It's a nice quick start. It's sort of some baked-in documentation. One of the things that buttons can do, though, is that they can associate with themselves both a command type and a command argument. This is sort of interesting, but not very useful until you get inside of a repeated list and do a little bit of data binding. But here's the scenario in this case. I have 3 companies. It's a little mini stock thing. And I want to be able to bubble from my list of data-bound companies buy and sell commands in my little position portfolio here. And what I've done is I have the names buy and sell on these buttons, but more than that, I have data bound behind those things to the command and to the command argument. And when I click buy on Microsoft, you can see that I have not only a buy command, but a specific command argument Microsoft. If I click sell on Intel, it's not cell in Intel, it's cell in 25 shares, because I bound different data to the command arguments on the different buttons. So it's a nice little abstraction. It's another set of properties that I can consume later. So a lot of these controls have a little more than you'd find on an HTML, the HTML equivalent, and in ways that permit them to participate more fully in the framework. Just to be truth in advertising, let me just show you the source on that guy. So I'm sorry, this doesn't get larger. Here's my button. And here I've set my command to buy, excuse me, my text to buy, my command to buy, and I've data bound the argument to the ticker, Microsoft, Intel, Dell. On this one, I've data bound the command argument to the shares. And then I have a function that my data, or my repeater calls. In fact, it's an event handler that I've wired up with this on-item command. This is the name of my event. And it's just right here. And my label gets set depending on the value of that command and the command argument passed in by the button. So I'm breezing over this, but I'm just trying to show you that the controls that are inside of the web controls package have a few more things tied into them besides just simply rendering HTML. Okay, let's go back to slides. I think we're going back to slides. Okay. So list controls. These are actually pretty nifty. These are controls that handle repetition, and some of them actually expose some customization. So the obvious ones, drop-down list and list box, those are like select. Radio button list and checkbox list are sort of an abstraction of some of the things you can do already with HTML if you're clever. And then there are three that are more advanced: repeater, data list, and data grid. Repeater I just showed you a minute ago with those buttons inside. And repeater is one of the controls that has the ability to say, I'm going to catch button clicks that are bubbled up to me and use them as item commands in my repeated list. I'm going to show you examples of using repeater, data list, and data grid in the next session. They're really not very useful without data binding, and I'd like to show data binding before we go too deeply into those three controls. We've seen them quite extensively, however, in the last couple of days in the applications that we've seen in the other sessions. An easy way to show that on the other machine here, right quick, is just to take a 1-minute tour through iBuySpy. This list here is a data list. This is a data list here. Sorry. Let's start again. This is a data list. Our most popular items is a data list. A bound data list. This is another bound data list here. This is a data list. Come back. This is a data grid. So those are two of the three bound list controls. And then finally, let's go back to slides. The last group. We have, for want of a better name, rich controls. These are really high level, they're really abstract. They're abstract not only in the way that they render. You can't predict the HTML that it will render. They're also abstract because they encapsulate a lot of behavior, a lot of logic. Currently, there are only a couple. In the bits that you have today, there's one that's called calendar and another one for add rotator. And they have a lot of sort of more complex logic. We'll have more in subsequent betas. And then finally, there are validation controls. So the validation controls automatically enable client and server validation. They're actually very, very interesting. There's very little code involved to make this go. And we'll cover that in some detail in the coming hour. But you can see there's several of them. We tried to cover the really common cases with required field validator, range validator, compare validator, regular expression validator. And then we have a custom validator that allows you to call your own function, write a function that you pass the value that you're trying to validate to, and it'll take care of it for you. And then you can hook it either on the client or the server or both. And then finally a summary that bubbles up or consolidates all of the validation errors in a single spot in the page. Here's that link. Now, it's an interesting link because I'm saying localhost, you're going to install it on your own machine and use it from there. But very, very useful to have the controls reference. So before we move forward, there are lots of other controls in the works, and a few of these you're going to be able to see something about today. First of all, mobile controls. These are controls that we saw demoed in the last couple of days in the general session demos. They can emit WML or other HTML-style coding for small devices like cell phones and so forth, pagers. There's a session that describes using these guys in ASP+. Also, you can build your own controls. It's actually relatively easy to do so. We've made a big effort to make it pretty easy to hook the framework. You can even derive from one of our controls and extend it. So maybe you like our calendar control, but you want to add some additional behavior to it. You could do that. These two sessions, building ASP+ server controls 1 and 2, describe to you how to do that. And then finally, there's another one. Maybe this belongs up in the other. I'm not sure this is custom, but the IE 5.5 folks are showing on Friday, they're showing ASP server controls that emit DHTML behaviors to clients that are of a certain level of IE and better. And they emit HTML3.2 to the rest of the browsers that they encounter. And we saw an example of that today in Bill's keynote. So that's controls. I have on the bottom of this list the next really interesting idea in ASP+, and that's pagelets. Now, I have them on the control slide because they are essentially controls. They work like controls. They participate in the ASP+ framework very much like controls. But you design them using the same techniques as you design ASP+ pages. So let's go here. So it's a very simple way to design them. We're going to do a few right now so you can see how they work. They support that same encapsulation that we've seen in the rest of these controls. You can nest other controls within them. You know, you can put buttons, calendars, text boxes, add rotators inside your pagelets. But they have a separate code namespace than the page itself. That means that if I have a text 1 inside my pagelet and a text 1 inside my page, they do not conflict. They can be in separate languages. So I can develop my pagelets in COBOL and my pages in C#. Pretty cool stuff. And it's a great way to partition work across lots of developers. But the main thing is that unlike server controls, the compiled controls that we just looked at, pagelets tend, not necessarily, but they do tend to be scoped to a particular application. So let's go back to iBySpy for a minute. So in the case of iBySpy, this list here is a pagelet. Across the top here, the search box, these buttons, and the graphics behind it, that's another pagelet. And this entire left bar is a pagelet. You use them a lot like you'd use an include file in ASP today, except that they have an object model, an execution model, and then they participate in the page framework, things like view state and postback that we've already seen. So they're quite a bit more powerful than your typical include file. Let's go back to slides for a sec. So to use a pagelet, So you've gone ahead and you made a page, an ASP page, and you say, I want to use that thing as a pagelet. What do I need to do? The first thing you do is you have to put a register directive in the page that's going to consume the pagelet. So in that iBuySpy page we just saw a minute ago, the main page has a register directive for the header pagelet at the top, the menu pagelet at the side, and the also bought pagelet down in the center. And that register directive looks something like this. Angle bracket percent, ampersand, registered, tag prefix equal, tag name equal, source equal. So the tag prefix can be anything that doesn't collide with another namespace that you're using, especially ASP. That would be a bad one to use. In the case of iBuySpy, we just use iBuySpy. Then there's a colon, then the tag name, and then you have to have run at server, but you can actually have other properties on that tag, other attribute value pairs. So pagelets can also expose an object model. All of the properties, fields, events, methods of a pagelet can be called from the hosting page. In this particular example, I show above the line, I show what's inside the pagelet. Or this whole thing is the pagelet itself. Above the line is the script block, and I declare a public field inside of that, which is called color. Down inside the rendering of the pagelet itself, the declarative part, I use that to set the font color, the forecolor of my pagelet. And I could set that from the hosting page. So let's run through a couple of these and see how they look. Let's see if I can find a good place to start here. Oh, hang on. Not that one. Oop, not that one either. That was the right one. Okay, so here's a page, an ASP page, and it has a register statement in it for tag prefix acme message, and it has a couple pagelets declared, and they look just like the tags for the server controls. But in this case, they have a font color property set. Green and red. The pagelet that they're using is pagelet4.aspx. And here's what pagelet 4 looks like, just like out of my slide. And indeed, you can use this, you can reuse the same pagelet with assigning different properties as many times as you want inside the page. So I could easily, say I want to have this one be purple. But I need to have a unique ID for each one. Those are the rules. Unique ID, run at server, assign the properties. Let's go ahead and run this guy. If you're in browser. And there it is. Red message, green message, purple message. Very, very simple. In fact, the simplest pagelets can be much simpler than that even. Let's go back to our page. And grab another one of these guys, and I'll call him simple. Let's go get pagelet 1. And just to show you pagelet 1, it's just some random text. It doesn't need to be, doesn't need to have an object model. It can be anything. It could be like or include would be. Let me make sure I've got everything saved. Go back and refresh this guy. Oops, do I have the right guy? Pagelet 4 or demo 5? Oh, I haven't consumed him. Would help. So acme, colon, simple, run at equal server. Something like that. There you go. So some random text. So they're very, very easy to consume. Very nifty. So a couple things I want to point out, going back to these pagelets. There's no HTML tags. There's no body tags and there's no form tags. The reason there's none of those things is that they would conflict with the hosting page. There can only be one form run at equals server in an ASP plus page. So you just leave them out, and they get included. It's sort of like an include file. You need to think of the structure of an include file. They can be brought in with the rest of your page, but they can't conflict with the overall structure of the HTML part of the page. Here's another pagelet that takes a text string. Same idea, but in this case I'm going to set my, let's go 3 here, and say the property will be text equal, this is another pagelet, something like that. Oops, Y, Z. Oh, and I get a parser error. What have I done? Oh, too many. Does not have a property name's text? Did I get it wrong? It's message. Great. Message equals. Keeping me honest. There we go. So we actually throw really great messages, by the way, really great errors. So that's interesting, but that's not really what I wanted to show you in this particular case. I said before that you could have your own page load, inside of that pagelet. It can have its own events, handle its own events, handle its own, have its own controls in it, and so forth. In this case, instead of having it set to the default message, what I want to do is I want to set this as a public string, and on the page load method, sub page load. This is actually kind of a drag. There's a lot of oops. What have I done? You sure I get this right? What have I done? There we go. I've taken off more than I wanted to. This is page. Yes, under. That's the part I was trying to avoid having to type. Could do something like that and have it actually execute some logic. Where it does a date. So it actually ran that logic in the pagelet. It's not very sophisticated logic, but I'm just trying to give you a sense that each of these pagelets is a unit of execution. Let's go back to slides. Sorry about that. I'm a really ugly typist. It's one of those skills I need to work on. So there's another trick you can do with pagelets. You can actually create pagelets programmatically. So now you're starting to maybe get the idea of, oh, wow. So I can create pagelets programmatically. I can actually construct the whole structure of my UI on the fly programmatically. It's really possible. In fact, we have an example inside this quick start called the portal that does exactly this. So what happens is that there's a method on page called load control, and it takes an argument, which is the string to the path to your file, your pagelet file. And by calling this thing, you can dynamically create new pagelets inside of your page. So in this example here, I show foo equal. It returns a programmatic identifier to your pagelet, page load, and then you can just do foo.color equal and make assignments, just like you've done elsewhere. Once you've created it, though, you need to insert it into the control hierarchy of one of your controls. So here's the thing that I haven't introduced you to yet. Certain kinds of controls are containers, and they have controls collections. A good example of this is panel. Panel actually renders as a div, and it's a great one to stick controls into programmatically. Another one would be something like label or data list or so forth. There are lots of different ones into which you can add controls. Let's go over and see this in action. Oops, go back here. There is a whole section on pagelets, including a discussion of exactly this. So here's one where we've actually created a pagelet for each of the items in this database. So we do page, we do control, C. Actually, let me go to VB. It's a little easier to understand. C1 equal load control, and the name of my pagelet. I set a property on C1 category equal business, and I add it to my controls collection of my page, just like that. And the pagelet itself is data bound. It's actually got a reasonably complex looking data list with all that information that we saw of title, category, publisher, and so forth. So in this little example, we just do it 3 times. C1, C2, C3, that's it. It's just done it in page load. And the page itself, this is the part of the page that would normally be visible in the HTML tags, is almost nothing. It just gets added in. So pretty powerful technology, and definitely worth investigating. Okay, let's go back to slides. So I want to be sure we have time for some questions. So I hope I've been able to demonstrate to you that this is pretty amazing in terms of the amount of simplification you can make to your applications. The ability that you have to programmatically work with things in a very consistent, well-encapsulated way. Not only within the pages, but also hooking page execution, but also working with controls and then with pagelets as well. There are a lot of new features here. You're not required to learn them all, but I really suggest that you spend some time playing with a quick start and going through some of the examples. There are a lot of related sessions. Before I want to, we've gone through most of these. These are in your slides, your printed slides. But I just want to comment that this book, you guys should have all received this when you registered, goes through a lot of this information in quite a bit of detail, especially chapters 1, 2, and 4. And then the quick start is another great place to go to figure this stuff out. So with that, I'd like to take some questions. I know somebody down here had some. Yes, sir. I think we need to give it just a minute. He's getting the... In fact, I'm going to back up to my reference slide of related sessions. You could. I have kind of... I don't see anybody back there turning up the mic yet.
One thing, to interactively debug with visual internet or whatever, do you have to be a rocket scientist, or does it work easy?
So the question is, interactive debugging with ASP+, you need to be a rocket scientist.
With the previous version, it was almost impossible to do. Like
So,
single stepping through and stuff.
yeah, so the debugging is quite a bit better because we are now all working with the common language runtime. And so the debugger targets the common language runtime. Having said that, there are a number of sort of, how we say, bugs in the debugger in the version that you have right now that we're still fleshing out. So you're not going to get very far probably with the PDC technical pre-release bits with the debugging. But it's our goal. Now that we have a common language runtime, the debugging should be much, much more seamless. Should is the operative word at this point in time, though. Yes, I agree. Does the mic work yet?
I think well, this one's working.
Great, that'd be great.
Hello? Okay. It wasn't clear to me during the presentation under what circumstances you would want to use the HTML controls versus the equivalent web controls. It seems like you would want to use the web controls
okay, so
all the time.
That's a pretty important point, and I'm sorry I didn't make it more clear. So HTML controls, I think the big win there is that you get an HTML page that somebody's designed for you, or you have a tool you like for HTML design, and you've got that design already set to go. But it hasn't had any ASP Plus functionality added to it during the design process. At that point, it's quite a bit simpler to just go to the HTML controls and then run at server the few that you care about, the few tags you care about, and do that. The second place where you might prefer it is you might just be an HTML wizard and you have that whole object model in your head. And so it's just simpler for you to work with HTML controls because they're more comfortable for you. Then it's just a lifestyle choice. There are a number of controls that only exist in the web controls framework. All the intrinsic kinds of controls exist in both places, but things like data grid and data list, the templated controls, calendar, validation, etc., are only in the other space. You can intermix them. There's nothing that prevents you from having some HTML and some ASP colon and some third-party controls and some pagelets all in the same page. So it's really a preference at that point. For the non-HTML controls, they have a stronger object model, a more consistent object model. They're strongly typed. So that's the trade-off. A lot of places they're really equivalent, though. Yeah.
Can you, in the book it says that auto postback is only supported by the checkbox. Is that going to be supported by the radio button and select boxes and other things like that?
You're talking about validation?
Well, no, there's actually an auto postback attribute on the checkbox that when you click it, it immediately does a postback to the server. Will that be supported with other controls as well?
So we're not sure. We're investigating that right now. So there are some sort of ups and downs to doing the auto postback that way. But we're looking at adding auto postback to a couple of the other controls. We realize it's not consistent yet across the framework.
Okay.
So auto postback, just for everybody else, is a property you can set on something like a drop-down list, for example, and changing the selection will also force a postback. But it is an option, so you don't have to do that. Yeah?
Do server controls work if the form is posted to a different page from the original one?
So hang on one second. Is there anybody back at audio? Yeah, I don't have anything coming from this speaker at all. I'm having a hard time hearing the questions. No, anyway, so ask your question again and I'll try and listen from this one.
What happens to server controls if there is no postback, if the post is done on a different page?
So to be really clear, you do not have to post back to the same page. That would make sense in certain form situations where you'd want to be able to round trip to the same page. The purpose of having a server control is really programmatic control on the server. So maybe you needed to use it programmatically on the server when you first rendered the page, but the page navigates off to someplace else.
Okay, so my question maybe should have been, what happens when a server control exists on a page, but it is posted to a different one? What happens on that second page?
So,
do you still have programmatic access to
no,
those?
you do not have programmatic access to controls that are on different pages.
Okay, would you be able to create, is there a way of hacking that if you would want to create those controls with the same names, for example?
So sure, you could make pages that have the same names. You might want to consider whether that's the right way to do it and whether you might instead want to make a page that does post back and it somehow changes the UI to work in the second scenario.
Okay, I have a second question, which is it possible to use page lists without having to use the add register directive? Because what I can see happening is people wanting to use the same pagelet on many pages, and then just having to do a pound include at the top of a file that does a register of a whole bunch of pagelets, which is stupid.
Yeah. So we're looking at finding a way to boil the pagelet registration down into the configuration file for the application.
Okay, thanks.
So right now, the way you're going to want to do it, though, is the register directive.
Thanks.
Hi. For Java applets, would there be any chance of making those capable of using some of these web controls?
Of making a Java applet use a web control. So to be really clear about a web control, it just renders whatever was coded to render. And so it can actually render all non-HTML things coming out of it. So you could render stuff that gets executed on the client and so forth. Even object tags you could render. So maybe that solves your problem. That you can do a Java, you can have a server control that renders Java to one kind of a browser if it has Java enabled, and something else to the other browser.
First, a clarifying question. You had said on pagelets you couldn't embed HTML into the pagelet. Is that correct?
Could or could not?
Could not?
Oh, yeah, we showed that. We showed a page that just had some static text, could easily be HTML.
Okay. The HTML
Oh,
tag
the tag itself, yeah. So typically it will work in many browsers, but not all. The place where you really get a conflict is the form tag. Mm-hmm. But if you're hitting a browser that can support nested HTML tags, and you don't care, it'll work.
It will work. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But it potentially could break in some browsers, so you have to understand what your scope of your app is going to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're not preventing you from doing it. The only place you'll get an error is if you nest a form tag.
Hi. I guess the first question is, what kind of criteria do you use to choose between a pagelet and a server control? Say like a server control that's a composite of other server controls.
Yeah. So I think the right place to slice it seems to be whether you think you're going to make a UI widget that makes sense inside of one particular application versus something that abstracts, a UI widget that abstracts a lot of functionality. So let me give you a couple of examples. We showed a menu pagelet, and that menu was really specific. It had not only rendering specifics like that logo, which is inside the pagelet, to iBuySpy, but also the data access to populate the list of categories for navigation was specific to only iBuySpy. On the other hand, something like a data grid could be used across any number of applications. So I think that's typically where we find people slicing between pagelets and compiled controls, is whether it's generic, more or less generic or multi-purpose across a number of apps, or whether it's really for a specific application.
Is it possible to do any sort of subclassing on a pagelet like you can do
So
on
it's currently
server
not
controls?
possible to subclass a page. We're looking at that, though.
Okay. Another question. We've noticed on the round trip that when you do the postback, if you've got a long data list, and you're like at the bottom of the data list and you want to change one of the elements in that data list,
Yeah?
after the postback you're at the top of the page. Is there any way to somehow insert an anchor tag so you're back at that control that the user was looking at
Oh,
before
yeah.
the postback?
So we're looking at that. So the issue there is it's actually a serious limitation that we're trying to understand how we can solve. One of the problems with postback is that if your cursor down below the fold, so to speak, you're going to, on postback, be positioned back up at the top of the page because it's re-rendered the page. So getting it to actually navigate back down to a particular row in the data grid is really kind of a problem. We're trying to find ways to handle the postback in a way that doesn't change the position on the page.
Right, we were originally thinking anchor tags or something like that, but then how do you generate the URL that forces
Oh,
that
so
anchor
generating the URL to say when I post back I'm going to navigate to a particular place inside the grid, it's actually possible to do. It's possible to data bind or to inject an anchor tag, an actual anchor, not the navigation, but the anchor, into every row in the data grid if you wanted to do it that way, or data list.
Right. But then the URL that references that anchor tag.
Right, so however you're forcing the postback,
Yeah.
Do you know how are you forcing the postback? From within the grid, or within the data list, or outside of it?
Either way.
So from within, it's pretty easy, because within you can create a button, for example, that will know what row it was on and be able to navigate back to it. But it's very kludgy. It's not the right solution,
Yeah,
and we really
problem.
need to take care of solving that problem.
Okay. Another question. Some of the composite controls, like the calendar control,
Yeah.
that support up-level and down-level rendering, are there any examples of that?
So calendar
you
doesn't.
mentioned that it was done with behaviors on the rich client side. Obviously, we know how it's working on the HTML3.2 side.
Right.
So it'd be nice
So-
to have an example.
So the question is, any good examples of up level, down level? Are you talking about examples for creating your own?
Yeah. We are going to be producing some server controls or pagelets or whatever. We'd like to see how you guys are doing it in DHTML versus, the universal client.
So we do have 2 sessions on creating server controls this week, and I believe that there is an example of up-level, down-level rendering in one of those sessions.
That's excellent.
Of the controls that we ship, to be really clear, the only ones that are doing anything significant up-level, down-level are the validation controls. Calendar that we shipped in the bits today does not do down-level or up-level rendering.
Okay. The Rocks book mentioned a preview control.
Yeah. It's not in the bits you got today.
Okay.
Hopefully beta 1.
This is probably a hard question. Framed sites. The page objects work on a page.
That's right.
Any plans on somehow being able to communicate between those page objects? For example, if you had a frame site.
So currently there isn't.
Okay.
And it was sort of one of the first questions I came up with when I joined the team, saying, well, so, how about, how do we do this communication across pages? And the bottom line is that once you wrap your heads around pagelets, I find it's very easy to forget about using frames and just do pagelets as your means of segmenting your app.
Unless you want scroll bars.
Unless you want scroll bars?
Scroll bars.
Interesting. So you could put the pagelet inside of a div with a scroll bar, but...
Well, if that's an implementation.
But that's
I was
another...
curious if you were aware of that problem and thinking of it.
Well, so we don't currently have any way to communicate across instances of the page. They all render separately. So if you're in a frame set, one instance of the page in frame A is going to be rendered and gone, no longer, indisposed, before the next instance is brought up and executed.
Right. And it would be nice to be able to, one of those page objects to talk to the other one.
Yeah, understood.
Okay, thank you.
Take the next questions offline. We've got to set up tapes and get some other things done.
Okay. I just reckoned it was me, so I could do whatever I want. So can you shut my mic off? Okay, so... Actually, I think... Oh, I still have it. So I'm going to take the rest of the questions down here. They're going to do a little bit of surgery on the demo here.
Okay.
Are you in here next?